the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today I'm buzzing up to Seattle to pierce the container of my colleague Amanda Moreno. You've just started to do this amazing new way of bringing astrology to the world. Can you tell me a little bit about that before we jump into the show?
Yeah, it's actually something I've been thinking about for years, but decided to do, which is opening a year-long container where folks can connect with the zodiacal archetypes in relationship to the land that they live on. So, it's got like relational approaches and animism at its core, but it's asking people to look at what does Cancer season look like in the world around you? What are your memories of Cancer season? Like, we do collaborative playlists. We're also bringing in Greco-Roman mythology as well as the mythology of like the people who have inhabited the land for long periods of time. So it's that kind of like multidimensional learning that I really love.
I love that. Oh my gosh, that's so awesome. And to see that happening in Cascadia as a bioregion, it seems like it's very anchored in how astrology erupts out of this specific place.
Wow, this is such an interesting place to live with astrology because it feels like there's so much going on that approaches the many different layers of the craft.
For sure, for sure. So how did you enter the stream of astrology?
I mean, the first thing was when I was like 11 or 12, I was in Claire's boutique in the mall and I saw a poster that said Aquarius at the top. And like, I knew that's what I was, but it had 3 paragraphs and it was the first time in my life where I had felt like seen because so many other things didn't make me feel seen. And I still have that poster.
You bought it?
I did. I bought it. I have kept it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I want to ask for a copy to hang up at CAELi.
Oh yeah,
just stick it. I want to have one of those like Italian restaurant bathrooms that just has a bunch of photos and posters and stuff.
I mean, it has like an art border, so it's got like the sun at the top, and then it's like electric blue with all kinds of like squiggly lines down the border.
Ah, yes.
But that kind of like piqued my interest, and then I was very, my love affair was more loosey-goosey until I was in my 20s. And then I kind of plopped out of my undergrad career with a love of studying social sciences and the evolution of human consciousness and was like, well, what am I going to do now? I guess I'll start studying astrology and tarot. And then it just kind of like took off from there.
Yeah. So what was your first astrology book?
So I think, in reality, first books were probably like love signs or, any of the relationship astrology books from the 80s and 90s. But the first book that I read cover to cover was Astrologik by Antero Alli. And it really like hit me at a point in my life where I was really opening up to things like chaos magic. I was reading a lot of like Robert Anton Wilson and Terence McKenna and like reading about psychedelics and food of the gods and things like that. But it was an approach to astrology that centered like human experience. And it was the first time I'd seen someone refer to astrology as a language, which was really helpful for me. And, just like overall, like Antero Alli, who recently passed, actually, was a really interesting creature. He was really interested in like paratheater, which was like, ritual theater and dramaturgy. And he was very dramatic. And so like, even just looking at the cover of the book, which kind of has these like bluish designs on it, it's just like, ooh, there's something like deep and involved and intimate going on here, which my Scorpio moon loves. But he's also looking at astrology as like an oracular art. And so instead of using it as a way to like determine what will be, he's using it as a way of figuring out how can we can kind of like dance inside of relationships with the cosmos and get to know the planets as gods and get to know, the zodiac as archetypal energies. But it's also really succinct and clear in some ways. So he breaks down, planets, signs, and houses and aspects in ways that my brain could really latch onto. Like, I had really struggled with my Jupiter and Virgo in the first house. I was like, I don't know what this is. And this was like, oh, you get to know yourself through experiences. And also, you might have a really hard time with stand-up comedy because it feels really offensive. And I'm like, this is, yes, this is me.
Wow.
Like, when I watch stand-up comedy, I'm just like, oh man, is it hurting someone's feelings?
Oh no. That's incredible. Yeah. So it sounds though that this first book cover to cover has transmitted all the way through to what you're working with now in this new container.
Absolutely.
To an extent.
Yeah, I mean, he gets really into the kind of like experiential portions of it. So like, how do you, take what an author says or what an astrologer says about astrology and then like apply it to your life, and like, does it make sense? But he also brings in, the weavings of magic and shamanism. And he, at the end has a bunch of essays about the outer planetary transits at the time he wrote it, which were like Neptune and Aquarius and things like that, talking about it in terms of what's happening at the collective level with climate change and things that have it's always been really meaningful to me to use astrology as a way of addressing bigger issues.
Yeah.
And so it goes through all of that as well. And so it's really like comprehensive and philosophical and practical and magical.
Amazing. I love that. Taking what an astrology book says and applying it to yourself. When you said that, you reminded me of a time earlier on when I was reading Michael Luton's book about Saturn. And in it, he's like, your Saturn is like next to a fire that's gone out trying to get comfort. And I'm like, whoa, I don't know if I want to apply that to my life.
Yeah.
Like, yikes.
Yeah, sometimes you read those descriptions and you're like, wow, that's really rough and hard to work with. And then sometimes you read those descriptions and you're like, okay, I guess it's still kind of also true.
Right? Like, oh no, here I go on my old campfire. So speaking of abandoned campsites, what 3 books would you take with you if you were to be on a deserted island?
Yeah, well, the first one is gotta be Cosmos and Psyche. And I think that like I found Astrologik probably a year before Cosmos and Psyche. And I, like I said, have had this love of like the evolution of human thought and sociology and like, why do humans act collectively in the ways that they do? And so when I found Cosmos and Psyche, I was like, wait, you can do what with astrology? Like, you can track collective movements this way. And I still remember very clearly like the lighting in the room when I started reading the book, because it just got into my brain in this way and my heart. But I think one of the biggest things about Cosmos and Psyche for me was that there's a chapter called like Two Suitors, a Parable. And it's talking about mythological lens and paradigm, like kind of equating our moment now to what was happening when we shifted from an Earth-centric model of the universe to a heliocentric model. And right now we're existing within the myth of the fall and the myth of progress, which like the myth of the fall is about essentially everything back then was better and we're in this like progressive descent from it. And then the myth of progress being that like everything in the future is better, onward and upward, infinite expansion, while at the same time existing within a cultural framework that says that the universe is inherently mechanistic. And we don't question that one. I mean, we do.
Yeah.
Right? But like,
one should not, right?
Yes. And so it gets into like how astrology can help us to navigate the nuances that they're in the necessary paradigm shift that we live in. And when I think about like being, maybe it's not alone on a desert island, but when I think about being on a desert island and think about things that are like infinitely inspiring and, intriguing to me, that book is definitely one of them.
Yeah, I mean, through it, you could still have access to the entire history of culture to a certain extent. Well, not entire, that's a horrible totalizing word, but you would be able to bring a lot of people with you mentally through it.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I thought about was like, who would be my companions? And, one of the other books, Understanding Karmic Complexes by Patricia Walsh. Also, I think about it in terms of storytelling, because so much of astrology is storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
But Understanding Karmic Complexes is like Patricia's compilation of case studies from her past life regression practice, which she combines with evolutionary astrology. And one of my big turning point moments with astrology was seeing Patricia lecture at NORWAC in 2010. It was called like Planets Square the Nodes or something like that. And
Ooh, skipped steps.
yeah, I immediately was like, holy crap, this can hold the weirdness of my experience, like this model of working with charts. And I instantly like left and then sprained my ankle because I was so in my head.
Oh my gosh.
thinking about it.
Hopefully you won't be doing that when you're all alone on the desert island.
Correct.
Wow.
But it is like, I think narrative astrology is so important because, again, like mythology, story, following the energy of the archetypes with story is so helpful in learning it. And so this one gives like people's past life stories along with images of their charts so that you can see like the infinite nuances and complexity of how these symbols can kind of like act out in the world.
Right. Do you know if there's any kind of astrology that tells you about your future lives, if we can go into the chart and see past lives?
Oof. I'm sure there is. Sometimes I know like in past life regression, people have potentially future lives show up, but that seems like an area to investigate for sure.
Yeah. I always get frustrated when you realize that the starlight you see is all in the past and you can't just turn in the opposite direction and see starlight in the future.
Yep.
It's like physically impossible.
Yeah, there's no linearity there.
Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support CAELi before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the CAELi Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.caeli.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support CAELi into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show. So, what would be the third book you would take with you onto this beautiful deserted island?
Yeah, the third one, and I'm sure this is a common problem on the show, is difficult.
Yes, it's actually so hard.
Yep. But I ended up going with Mysteries of the Dark Moon by Demetra George. And again, we've got like the storytelling component here. This is such a great resource for the mythology of the heavy quotes, darker goddesses, or like more tumultuous, nocturnal, sometimes just like quieter, but it also gets into like the fates. But when I was thinking about Desert Island, I was like, I wish that I'd read more books about astrology and herbalism or like the practical things. And so when I was kind of flipping through this one, I was like, okay, it's got the storytelling component that would keep me engaged, but it's also got, you know, the cycles of the moon phases. It's like basic astrology.
Yeah.
So, and then it has like, because it is getting into the more emotional realms and the more intense realms, it also has these kind of like journal questions, which I really appreciate for like integration purposes.
Oh, yeah.
So that you can kind of bring it all in.
For sure. And it's one of those books that goes into what we might rather not look at.
Absolutely.
You know, about the feminine experience, or just this, you know, if we live in an age of enlightenment, it's talking about the endarkening.
Yes, very much. And that, like, what would we rather not look at is kind of like the basis of my whole astrological practice.
There it is.
You know, like, how those things need to be witnessed and held too, right? So that they can get some airtime and, you know, hopefully come into integration.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. The workshop elements that Demetra always includes in her books is one of the most intense things. It's not common to see an astrology book be that interactive and ask you to participate with it, you know?
Yep. It's such a great way to teach, especially through books, which can be so cerebral or like ungrounded. And so to put essentially workshops in a book is such a great strategy.
Yeah. So of the goddesses that she discusses in Mysteries of the Dark Moon, do you have a particular relationship with one of them or a couple of them?
Oh, goodness. I have tried to work with Lilith in the past. Lilith came into my life at a time when I was dealing with a lot of really significant health issues. I have natal Lilith and Virgo. And so I was like, great, I'm going to research Lilith and I'm going to get to know this being. And my body couldn't hold it. The first way that she came to me was in a vision that was in a dark cell. And then all of a sudden I felt this like massive anger and she exploded the room with her rage.
Wow.
And I was just kind of like, okay. And I kept in it for a little bit because I was like, I'm going to write a book about Lilith. And then I was like, I can't do this right now.
Wow.
So I have lots of respect for her.
Right.
For sure.
Maybe on the island you could get around to writing that book, though.
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be. Yeah.
But it speaks to the relational, right? Because you were talking about the initial relationship here, but then I'm hearing in the container you've built now that there's this longer term relationship and this idea of, and even you put it in this way of like dancing in the ritual theater of the cosmos with Antero Alli's book. There's this idea of like, what is it like when you have long-term relationships with these astral entities?
Absolutely. And I think that relational part is just so important. Like, I used to think of relationality just in terms of like client and practitioner, but now it is like, no, you are in a dance with the cosmos. Like, what is the longer term relationship with Venus? How is it going to change? How are you going to get to know her on her own terms rather than just as like a facet of your own soul?
Yeah. Instead of seeing the chart as a map of your soul, it's like this life world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's go back to Understanding Karmic Complexes by Patricia Walsh for a moment, because that's a totally new book to me. And you said it was a compilation of stories, but what would be like your favorite part of that you're taking it with you onto this island?
Yeah. So, there's a level of like intrigue and fascination for sure when past life content comes up, but also the way that this book is arranged is that it divides the chapters into the archetypes of the zodiac. And so you'll have several stories in the Cancer chapter, several stories in the Leo chapter. And I really love that because it makes it so that you can kind of apply what you're learning, very generally speaking. And it also kind of gets at the core themes of how these things might show up in life. So, a Pisces complex might show up in patterns of escapism or being really drawn to monastic living or, having a tendency to be very spongy and, gathering people's emotions. And so then like, what are some examples of what that might look like in a person's life and then how they work with it? And so it gives you a lot of flexibility with how you're imagining the archetypes. But also it's just really powerful work to have people come in with their, past life contents or early life contents and say like, this thing keeps showing up as if it were fated in my life. How can I get some witnessing and healing from it? And so there's a level of like hopefulness that comes through the book as well as the inspiration.
And do you think that witnessing is part of the healing act?
Absolutely. I think so many people carry around really extreme layers of guilt and shame. I mean, we live in a society that's built on like control through guilt and shame. And so that we have these expectations about like how we're supposed to be. And when we get into shadow integration work, which is what past life stuff is, it allows experiences that are very uncomfortable or that we want to disown to come to light to see that like the psyche is inherently geared towards healing. The universe is inherently geared towards healing. There's nothing that's beyond redemption. And I think that when there's like space held for that, then there's room for like dealing with the grief or the shame or the guilt and then like moving forward instead of spending all of our energy like repressing that stuff. And so there's a lot of creative potential that comes through as well.
Amazing. Yeah. I'm wondering also if readers of Patricia's book would be part of the long-term healing of the fact that someone's story was shared at all for all time. In a way, like that's kind of a permanent witnessing that's possible or rendered possible by the act of writing it. but that there is a relationship between the witnessed and the witnessing and the witnesser.
Absolutely. That also kind of makes me think of like that whole time is more multidimensional. And so then these stories are out there and they exist to be held and like, is seen in a way that can feel very healing.
Yeah. Transmitting that work towards the future. Very cool. So if someone were going to want to learn astrology, what books would you put in their hands?
So the first thing that comes to mind that I'll just mention very quickly is a workbook called Astrology for Yourself by Demetra George and Douglas Block. And I like that because it's just like workbook style, like get your chart out there on the paper and do all the nuts and bolts, because that can be a tedious thing, but it's also very necessary. So with the more, my specific lineage side of things, I always tell people when they want to go into evolutionary astrology with me to read Healing the Soul by Mark Jones. I think it's a really rich and insightful and yet accessible look at Pluto and the lunar nodes in particular. And one that doesn't, with evolutionary astrology, people can get really overly fascinated with the past. And it's like, no, we still want to be here in the present. And so he presents evolutionary astrology as a way of, looking at our patterns and our deepest attachments and, a lot of our pain and suffering in ways that we can then say, again, like, I see you. And now, like, how are we going to move forward with this? Or like, what ways does the chart show us we can work with this material? And so it has that blend of very practical how-to, but also the philosophical stuff that is so important to the way I relate to the work.
Amazing.
The second one would be Making the Gods Work for You by Caroline Casey. This book it's somewhat new to me, actually. I came across it when I was teaching at Portland School of Astrology, and I really love it for several reasons. I think the biggest one is that she starts with something called visionary activist principles. And so I am a sucker for any astrological practitioner or book that is going to say, we're living at a time of great change, and here's how we can make astrology relevant to participating in, hopefully, like, moving through the challenges we face in a way that leads us to something better. And so this book is like really whimsical. It's very like devoted to what I would call collective liberation, but it is also very thorough. It goes through the signs of the zodiac. It talks about the planets, again, in terms of personal relationships, like moods as messengers from the moon that are, trying to clue you into what's going on in the undercurrents. It gives you like rituals that you can do to work with getting to know your Jupiterian themes. And so it brings in this kind of, again, like three-dimensional way of working with the skies. And she's got a lot of like, trickster energy going on in this book as well that is encouraging you to have fun with things. But even though it's, it'll take you through like Mercury by sign, it doesn't read as a cookbook. It reads as like a novel that you can keep by your bedside and laugh every time you pick it up.
Oh, yeah. And it's got the best purple color. I mean, there's the kind of astrological purple book that a lot of publishers make, but this one is like a nice plummy purple. It's perfect.
Plummy purple, yeah, with like the constellations in the background too.
Yeah.
It's lovely.
Cool. Yeah.
So then the third one is Post-Colonial Astrology by Alice Sparkley Capp, Reading the Planets Through Capital, Power, and Labor. And I love this book so much. Like, I think it's one of the most exciting astrology books I have read. And part of that is because I'm always thinking about lens. So, like, studying the tradition of the craft is so important and its history, but also, like, recognizing that Hellenistic Greece had its own philosophy and like its own way of categorizing the cosmos that is important to understanding the craft, but might not necessarily be relevant to all bodies today. And so post-colonial astrology really gets into the fact that the interpretation of Venus as, ruled by Libra, or switch those around, right?
Yeah.
Is a construct of a certain time, and that there's lots of different ways to think about it. And it gets into kind of like the history of the colonial world, which I think is really important. So it's definitely more of like an academic text. You can also like listen to Alice Barkley Cat talk about the book on interviews and stuff like that if reading it is not your thing. But getting into even just like the etymology of the words, like the etymology of Saturn or the etymology of Jupiter, and like where those myths came from and what they meant at that time is super important, I think, to understand the biases in our craft.
Yeah, it's definitely a path-breaking book in that way. And I hope to see more interventions like it from other perspectives as well. I think it opened up, it sort of set down a gauntlet for a really important conversation.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation that's not always easy to have, but I think it's so important to like the ethical practice of astrology that we have conversations about our delineations and like be open to hearing about where they might be harmful or like not universally applicable.
Right. Yeah. That idea of, even when I'm reading about stuff written in German in the astrological community, they're assuming a universal that, if you're coming at it as a scholar from the United States, you're like, that's not universal. That's totally German. Like even though astrology seems like it's universal, it's not.
Yeah, it's like astrology is universal, but it's also a sponge. Like it's lived through so many civilizations and cultures and like adapted to them and informed them, which makes it great, but also tricky.
Yes, definitely tricky. Very cool. Well, are there any last books you'd want to put in anyone's hands, or?
I've got the Archetypal Cosmos kind of like pinging in my brain right now. The Archetypal Cosmos by Chiron LaGrice, which is taking the work of Cosmos and Psyche and kind of bringing it forward into like looking at how we can work with astrology as a cosmology, blending it with math and biology and science and mythology and psychology. Because, astrology is true for everyone, whether they believe in it or not. In some ways, like it's happening for everyone, whether they believe in it or not. And so this book really goes into a deep dive of kind of like looking at what astrology is, how it can be useful at the personal level and the collective level. And it's just a great like philosophical book that deserves an honorable mention.
Awesome. I love that. Yeah. The sun always rises and sets until it doesn't, right?
Exactly.
If you don't believe in astrology, it's like, okay. Oh, awesome. So how can someone join your container and find you in this world?
So all details would be at my website, aquarianspirals.com, Instagram, Aquarian Spirals. And I love hearing from people. So like, even if you just have a question about something I said here and want to reach out, I will totally back and forth about it.
I love that. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much for spending time of your day with us here and sharing your mind and the books that have moved your heart. And I really appreciate the way that you go about the craft. It's very refreshing. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.